And it looks like we're just about at start time. So why don't I start the introductions? I'm sure people will continue to trickle in, but if that's okay with you, Jason.
Oh, that's fine. Whatever you need. I'm on fairy time, so.
All right. We're all on fairy time today.
We're on fairy time right now.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome. My name is Joanna Ebenstein with my colleagues Leticia Barbier, who is my partner in Morbid Anatomy, and Christina Marcello, who is here as well, though invisibly as the owl in the skull. We are Morbid Anatomy, and we are an organization that produces lectures and classes and books and all sorts of things kind of at the intersections of art and medicine, death and culture, and also increasingly esoteric and underserved topics, I guess you could say. Tonight, well, actually, before we get started with today's talk, I want to just tell you about a few upcoming events. So we do a regular Monday night lecture series, also often on weekends. Our talk tomorrow night is a talk I'm personally very excited about. It's called Theorizing Feminist Future Magics with writer, curator, and folklorist Dr. Amy Hale. And then we have the following Monday, a free talk, which is called From Illustration to Tarot Symbolism, Uncovering the Development of the Artwork of Pamela Coleman Smith with author and tarot scholar Susan Wands. You can find out more about these events on our calendar. Christina just put a link to that in the chat, so you'll all have access to it. I also want to let you know, you probably noticed that we're recording. We record most of our talks, about 99%, and we put them on our Patreon. So if you're a member of our Patreon, which we call the Morbid Anatomy Online Journal, you have access to most every talk we've been doing since we started this at the beginning of COVID. And that's about 220 now. So for $5 a month, you have access to that, along with illustrated articles, interviews, virtual tours, and all sorts of other things. Christina will put a link to that in the chat as well if you want to check it out. I also want to let you know that you do have the ability to have a transcript of the event. If you see at the bottom of your screen where it says CC, there's a button that says CC, show captions. If you click that, you'll be able to see in typed out words what the presenter and what I'm saying as well. And finally, I want to say that if you have any questions for the speaker, he's very happy to take them at the end. We'll share them via the chat. So just type, if you could save them to the end so we can find them more easily, we can share them with the presenter. And I said finally, but actually there's one more thing I want to say. This is a talk that is kind of a teaser for an upcoming class by today's presenter. The class is called A History of Fairies from Fearsome Gods to Friendly Guides. And we will put a link to that in the chat as well if you want to know more. So finally, I'm going to introduce the speaker, Jason Lahman, who is an American visual artist, sculptor, poet, and cultural historian. He studied illustrations at Parsons School of Design and art history at the New School in New York City. And he also holds a master's in modern European history with an emphasis in the history of science and technology from SF State University, where he taught in the humanities department. He completed his PhD coursework in the history of science at the University of California, Davis, and has lectured widely on the topic of technology and visual culture, with a special emphasis on early cinema and automata. Currently, he is based in Portugal, where he maintains a full-time studio art practice. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to today's speaker. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Jason.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanna. It's so great to be back with all of you today. The last time I was with you, I was talking about robots. And so we're moving in a slightly different direction, and we're going to be talking about fairies. As Joanna said, this is a kind of a prequel, teaser, a bit of a sort of a promotional tool for the upcoming 6-week course that I'm going to be teaching through Morbid Anatomy. The first class will be Walpurgis Night, April 30th. Very, very excited about it. This is a topic I think I could say I've been interested in my whole life. And it just felt like this was the right time to finally try to put it all together in some form and share what I have discovered with you. So thanks again to Morbid Anatomy for providing the venue for this. So today, what I'm really going to be placing an emphasis on is the last few centuries, focusing mostly on Western Europe and North America. In the class, we're actually going to be taking a broader view, and though the emphasis will continue to be sort of the Western European fairy, we're going to be looking at many cultures from all over the world and sort of a wide variety of human spirit relationships cross-culturally that echo and are related to, in an anthropological way, to the Western European fairy. But today, What I really want to focus on is the topic of modernity. So the transformations that have been wrought by industry, by science, and also by mass media in the Western world, but also globally, particularly with the advent of modern capitalism, colonialism, and sort of the vast modern world of interchange that we find ourselves in. Because what I hope to show is that the fairy and the fairy being as we now understand that is really the result of these incredible transformations that have really affected the entire planet. So without further ado, let's jump in. So I want to define just the key terms and the themes that I'm going to be going over today. I think it's always helpful to provide a little bit of a roadmap. So we are going to be talking about fairies, but we're also going to be talking about their relatives, because fairy is kind of an amorphous term. And as I hope to show, it is related to very, very specific changes in culture and also cross-cultural communication. We're going to be looking at modernity, which is roughly the period of 1500 to now. Obviously, that can be sort of problematic as you dig into it, but for our purposes, it's going to be sort of a helpful way to kind of bracket the topic. So within the last 300, 400, 500 years, I want to be talking about the transformation in religion and science. And what I mean by that is not only the way that religion and science have been transformed in and of themselves in their relationship to society, but also how our relationship to things like authority, evidence, proof, and the truth have changed in their relationship to religion and to science. Of course, if we're talking about fairies, we have to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and we have to talk about the changes in our material relationship to ecology in the natural world. And fairies play an enormous role in that, or I should say our understanding of fairies. I want to talk about nostalgia, because I want us to be thinking about how the fairy, as we now experience the fairy, is related to a yearning for some of what we've lost in the modern period. And so I'm thinking of something like I call it retro connectivity. We want to connect to the things that we think we have lost or that we feel that we have lost. And so we're very often looking backwards. And of course, nostalgic media. If you think about the fairy, you know the fairy. I mean, maybe you know the fairies through some type of a personal encounter with one. But culturally, we really know the fairy through illustrations, through films, through fairy tales. And so these types of cultural creations have crystallized and objectified this type of a nostalgia for this thing that seems to have been lost to us. In cultural history, we call these sorts of things products of sort of psychological tourism. And then I want to point something else out, because as a historian who has studied media for a long time, and when I teach my courses on modernity and technology, I talk a lot about how mass media and how also the technology of media, entertainment media, the way that we get our information, how that has really moved us out of our bodies. Modern human beings, for the most part, don't live in the fullness of their bodies. They live in their heads. And more, and I mean this as an actual sort of physiological experience, we as human beings, for the most part, when we're engaged in like what we're doing now, right? It's our head and it's a screen. And that type of a technological physical relationship has an impact on how we experience reality. So as I just said, the fairy as we understand it is a modern manifestation of something that's much older, but the forms that the fairy takes is related to, as I've said, the transformations, the pressures, and also I would say certain types of commitments that we've made within modernity. So I'm putting up two images from the Victorian period, well known probably to many of you, of course, William Blake. And it's his image of Oberon, Titania, and Puck dancing. That's from 1786. And, if you know about William Blake, you know that he saw spirits. He witnessed things like fairy funerals. And Blake was very, very much in touch and very much concerned with what the Industrial Revolution was doing to human beings. From a little bit later, a very, very beautiful, and perhaps you could say saccharine painting of a fairy by Sophie Anderson, titled, this is the title, "Take the fair face of woman and gently suspending with butterflies, flowers, and jewels attending. Thus your fairy is made of most beautiful things." So again, the modern fairy is very much, in certain ways, the product of a very particular type of Victorian aesthetics. So bear that in mind. So let's get down to brass tacks. What is a fairy when we're talking about a fairy? Well, we can think of the fairy as a citizen or a denizen of another parallel realm, echoing the human realm in many ways. And if we're looking at primary sources, at first-hand accounts, when we can find them, of people who have encountered the fairies, sometimes it's solitary, but very often they're encountering a group of fairies. And sometimes those fairies are, as they're called in certain aspects of the Irish tradition, the gentry. So they seem to be a very sort of noble retinue. They are the aristocrats of the spirit world. At least that is one of the ways that they have been encountered over time. But then also they are very often encountered in relationship to natural landmarks, sometimes to culturally significant sites, and all over the world. In particular, you find water spirits, and water spirits can very often be the sources of wisdom, but they're also very, very dangerous, particularly if they manifest in a form that is erotically alluring. We'll be talking a lot more about that in a minute. The siren, the mermaid, the knock, the nix, the water horse, all of these different things are very sexy, and they can be very, very dangerous. But also, fairy beings can have a more benign and protective relationship to a natural place or to a domestic space. And so here I've pulled up two early 20th century images of two Slavic guardian spirits, the Vodyanoi and the Domovoi. So the Vodyanoi is a water creature, the water goblin in the opera Rusalka. He's the father of Rusalka, sort of almost like a freshwater King Neptune. And then the Domovoi is like the brownie. He's the fellow who lives in the house and will help out with household chores, and the housewife, the members of the house will very often leave offerings to the Domovoi to make sure that the household continues to have good fortune. And of course, you find things like that all over the world, right? The household spirit. But if we are going to use the term fairy, I think it's important that we talk about where that word comes from. I want to point you, some of you might know about this site, Edym Online, one of my favorite websites. It's a wonderful place to go to look at the etymology of words. And when I teach, and just when I'm having fun doing my research, I often find etymology to be a really helpful way to think about a particular topic, because when we understand the lineage of a word, when we understand the genealogy of a word, the way that a word has traveled through time, all of a sudden, all different types of associations can suddenly come to mind, and things that we have never thought about as being related suddenly seem to come together. And so at the root of fairy is fate. So fairy comes from the 12th century, excuse me, the 13th century, the country or the home of supernatural or legendary creatures. So fairy is fairyland, and it comes from the Old French. And it goes back to fata or fatum, which is the Latin word for fate. And we think it goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root ba, which means to speak or to tell. So within our word fairy, we have fate, we have the very act of speaking or of telling. And if we think about not just the fairy tale, but also the very act of speaking as a magical act, right? The speaking of a spell, or when we, were literate beings and not, when we were oral beings and not literate beings, the chanting and the singing around the fire, right? So these things have deep, deep, deep connections in our anthropology. Now let's talk a little bit about fate. Fate can be related to the fates, right? Or also to the guiding spirit. And again, if we're thinking about the history of the fairy as it travels from Old French, during the Norman conquest coming into England, we can sort of track this really interesting thing back to these much older primordial goddesses. And fairies in many ways are gods and goddesses. This is a really lovely image painted at the end of the 19th century called Destiny. And you can see it's very mysterious. A woman looking at what looks like a crystal globe, and then perhaps we have the three fates behind her. Maybe they're all the fates. And then there's a figure behind the three fates that is Destiny. And if you look at the ancient Greek theogonies, the three fates are the children of something even older, and that is necessitas, nemesis, an even more primordial being or entity that is the personification of that which must come to pass. And so in this really beautiful image, using these really, these beautiful female deities, we have a much older idea for how the universe operates. Things are interconnected through an ascending, descending chain of power, the great chain of being. You find this in Kabbalah too, the idea of emanations. And we're going to talk about fairies being sort of at the midpoint of this sort of chain of beings in a minute. But it's here in the idea of the fates. The fates control the gods, the fates control human beings, but behind the fates is something even more primordial and strange. And there are threads, there are connecting threads of energy and power that run through all of these entities, right down to the fates, the strings that pull on us. If we think about fairies as fates, and we think about the way that they operate in stories, they're often weavers, they're spinners, they're gift givers, think of Sleeping Beauty, they're life takers, they're the arranger of events, they're the knowers of the future, and very often they're the deliverers of justice. So that's the fairy, fata. But I also, and we'll go into much more detail on the Alfar and the elves in the class. Alfar, or the word elf comes from, is a similar type of creature that comes from the Northern European Germanic world. And Alfar are things that are still believed in, like if you go to Iceland. And that's a big part of sort of Icelandic tourism and Icelandic culture, is the perpetuation and the commitment to the idea that the natural world is filled with intelligences. It is filled with Alfar. And so in the 19th century and the early 20th century, as you get things like the revival and the interest in Norse mythology, particularly as it's related to nationalism, a lot of illustrators and painters are imaging the Alfar. And they're a lot like the fairies, although usually they don't have wings. Something as a cultural historian that I always come back to in my teaching is getting my students to think about the relationship of material culture, anthropological objects, and this is something that is a big part of the Morbid Anatomy community, the stuff, right? Whether we're talking about craft, whether we're talking about the things that we make these objects out of, it's very, very important to think about the material culture of making, particularly in the relationship to things like fairies. And I want to point something out. So in fairy tales and in folklore, fairy beings are very often the guardians of particular types of crafts. And when they manifest to human beings, or when human beings go to them, they very often are doing something that is related to a particular type of craft or skill. So we have the spinning and the weaving that comes up in a lot of the old fairy tales. We have cobbling, tailoring, and sewing, like in the story of the shoemaker and the elves. Think about blacksmithing, forging, metallurgy, the gnomes who live in the earth. This is an image of Freya going down into the earth to get the necklace from the Nibelungs. And then, of course, if you're thinking about fairies and witches and the domain of particularly female occultism, brewing, cooking, and distilling. Because anthropologically, of course, the invention of cooking was one of the most important parts in the development of human beings. And so brewing, cooking, distilling, the cauldron is very, very much related to sort of a kind of a supernatural skill And in a lot of the folk tales, these types of skills are gifted to human beings by supernatural beings. It comes to humans through a kind of intelligence. Sometimes it's a fairy, sometimes it's a god, sometimes it's a fallen angel, a jinn, something like that. So in relationship to the Western European tradition, let's look at the classical world, because there is a relationship to sort of what fairies look like and fairy lore, looking back to the sort of Greco-Roman tradition. So, and here I've pulled up a couple of images for you from a Roman villa. We have Eros driving his chariot, and it's being pulled by two Sukis or Psyches, who are the manifestations of the soul. And very often these female demigods are shown with butterfly wings. If you go further back, the image of the soul itself is not even a butterfly winged being, it's simply the butterfly. Another image from a Roman villa, the household gods. And these are known as the Lares and the Penates. And when you would go into a Roman home, you would always find a space dedicated to the Lares and to the Penates. And very often they were the ancestor spirits, but sometimes they were also the spirits of a particular space, of that place, right, that had lived there for a long time. And occasionally these things would be related to serpents. Again, if we're thinking about classical spirits and their relationships to what we'll later call fairies, we have to think about satyrs, nymphs, river gods, these demigods, these divine beings that live in nature and that live very, very close to human beings, and that are seductive, but also can be very dangerous, but also the imparters of wisdom. Diane Purkis, who's written a wonderful book I would recommend to everyone called At the Bottom of the Garden, has drawn some really interesting connections to fairy lore and to the night demons of the Near East. And I'm going to pull up three of them here: Lilith, Lamashtu, and then the Lamia. So these are demonesses. These are female demons that come out of Semitic and North African traditions. And they are very, very much related to the danger surrounding childbirth and infancy. And of course, when we're talking about fairies, when we're talking about these types of supernatural beings that live very close to the human world, the very real human anxieties around death and around childbirth play into all of the mythologies. So Lilith, of course, many of you know this, in the Talmudic tradition is the first wife of Adam, who's a she-devil. And Lamashtu is a similar type of entity. And then the Lamia is a desert female demon who will devour men. She's also a seductress. And in the various traditions, mothers and travelers will very often wear charms to protect them against these she-devils, these succubi, as they're called in the Latin tradition. And they're related to things like, to infants dying suddenly, to women's breast milk drying up, to all of the difficulties around bringing children into the world. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today. We're going to spend a considerable amount of time on it in the class, but I want to bring up the idea of the changeling, because the changeling is really important in the mythologies of fairies, and that is the child who there seems to be something wrong with the baby. And the changeling is the idea that the baby you think is your baby is not. It is a replica. It is a demon or a fairy. Sometimes it's a fairy in baby form that's been left behind. And there's a whole body of literature around like the meaning of that. This is something that's very new to me. There are several saint stories that seem to relate to this. So here's an image from the 15th century of one of the Saint Stephens. I'm not sure which one, but he's being kidnapped by a devil, and a little devil baby is being left in his place. And of course, if you're a fan of Maurice Sendak and you're a Gen Xer, you probably came into contact with Outside Over There, which either probably delighted or terrified you as a kid. I was delighted and terrified by it as a child when I found it. That's Sendak's retelling of the changeling story. And in his version of the story, the little girl has to go on a quest to rescue her baby sister who's been kidnapped by the goblins. But the changeling is a very, very important element of the fairy lore. So when we're talking about fairies, and we're talking about the Western European tradition of fairies, or really anything, if we're talking about religion, the occult, the spirit world in Europe, we have to talk about Christianization. I think this is a really interesting image. Comes from a website called the Decolonial Atlas, which has all kinds of great maps. And this shows you, it's color coded, which areas of Europe were Christianized. In other words, it's usually when the elites of that society converted and then put pressure on their people to convert. So of course, it starts in the 1st century, but then it's quite interesting because if you look at this, you see all the way up into the 1800s, you still have the far north of Scandinavia, people like the Sami, coming into contact and being pressured by their leaders to convert. And the more you start to study the history of the conversions of the European tribes, the more you start to understand, first of all, how violent it is, but also how Christianity is still very, very pagan, right? So Christianity, as it has come to be, is the product of layer after layer after layer of a kind of a transformation of a religion brought in by missionaries, but also something that's also hugely political. And it's very much related to class. It's very much related to a whole variety of different issues. And you start to come to understand that there really is no such thing as Christianity. There are many, many Christianities, and what's below that, what's under it, what came before it never really went away. It just changed form and became imbricated into Christianity. And the whole lore of fairy is very much a part of that accretionary process over the centuries. I think this is quite fascinating. The way that fairy presences were explained in Christian terms is a very, very important part of fairy lore. So how were fairies explained by Christian people? They were thought often to be fallen angels who didn't fall all the way. So when Lucifer and his host were cast out of heaven, the sources tell us usually they agree it was a third of them. Well, it was 2/3 actually that rebelled. A third went to hell, a third stayed in heaven, and there were a third that were kind of ambivalent. They weren't sure. They got booted out anyway, but they weren't really that evil, and so they got stuck in the middle. So I'm showing you some wonderful images, one from the Middle Ages, one by Bruegel from a little bit later, of the fall of the rebel angels. And if you look at these things, the way that the medieval Renaissance and Baroque artists image them is very fairy-like sometimes. They seem part bat, part insect, part rodent, the sort of fanciful, interesting, phantasmagorical way that the Victorians in particular are going to give fairy images. You can see a lot of this sourced in these images of the falling angels. So Lady Jane Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde, was also very interested in Irish folklore. And so this is a direct quote from one of her books where she was collecting a lot of these stories. The Sidhe, or the fairies, that's the Irish name for them, are supposed to be the angels in heaven who were cast out by divine command as a punishment for their inordinate pride. Some fell to earth and dwelt there long before man was created as the first gods of the earth. Others fell into the sea, and they built themselves beautiful fairy palaces of crystal and pearl underneath the waves. But on moonlit nights, they often come up on the land, riding their white horses, and they hold revels with their fairy kindred of the earth, who live in the clefts of the hills. And they dance together on the green sward under the ancient trees and drink nectar from the cups of the flowers, which is the fairy wine. We're in the Romantic period, and this is a highly romantic reading of this folklore. But the story of those fairies being fallen angels is in older sources as well. And I think it's really interesting. Another explanation, as people in Europe who have been Christian sometimes for many centuries, but are still encountering the fairies and still believe in them or trying to explain them, is that they are perhaps remnants of a much older race or a much older people that have been either driven out or driven underground. And there is a wonderful book from the 10th century called the Book of the Invasions, which is one of these monks are writing it. So it's a Christian history of Ireland and sort of the Irish people. But they're pulling a lot of different sources in, not only the old pagan sources, but they're also looking at some of these older sources like the Greek tradition of writing histories. So here I have some images for you from John Duncan, a wonderful early 20th century painter of two of these tribes, the Fomorians and then the Tuatha De Danann, who are very often the ones who are connected to the Sidhe, to the fairy people who live in the hills. And the Fomorians are interesting because they're much darker. We think that the word Fomorian actually means from under the sea or from under the earth. We're not sure. And so there's a kind of an echo here in these medieval pagan Christian histories of earlier peoples, which is echoed in ideas that come from the classical world. First, there were the Titans, then there were the Olympians. First, there were the Fomorians, these horrible monsters, and then there were the much more human-like, beautiful Tuatha De Danann. This is very much connected to the tradition of folks looking at Neolithic sites as well. The word she can mean the tomb or the Neolithic hill, but it can also mean the beings that dwell there, the fairies. And so if you think about, people who, we have this here in Portugal as well. We call them the Portuguese people call them the Muros Encantados. So these are the enchanted Moros. These are the beings that live in the stones. And here, Moros is sometimes connected to things that are like fairies, but sometimes it's also connected to the Moors, the people who were here centuries, before and ruled in Portugal for many, many centuries. So oral history, the histories of peoples that have occupied lands, and then speculation all kind of come together in a kind of a folkloric history. And then this stuff gets, when people like the priests are trying to write this stuff down, they're like, well, I have this source. Well, we've got these old hills. Well, my grandmother told me. So again, if you're studying fairy history, a lot of this is this wonderful kind of untangling of what this stuff is and what it means and where it comes from. We don't always know. Fairies very often can seem very godlike or demigod-like, but fairies are often very also connected to the dead. And so these are just two images I have pulled up here. This is a wonderful image of the Tuatha De Danann done by a contemporary artist, where I think some almost vampire elements have been incorporated into it. And fairies are sometimes very vampire-like in the way that they can attack and seem to draw energy out of people. There's a wonderful romantic thing called the Cornish Litany, which I love. It goes from ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord, deliver us. And many, many illustrators have taken the Cornish Litany and done wonderful, wonderful art for it. But there, the fairy folk are being connected to things that are quite dark and scary. Olaus Magnus was a Swedish or perhaps Norse, I can't remember. He's a Scandinavian historian of the 1500s and 1600s. And this is an image from his text, a description of the northern peoples. And here, the elves are also called specters. And here's a line from the text. Travelers by night and those who stay alert to watch their flocks and herds are often encompassed by monstrosities of various kinds. Of these, Saxo of Solland, some source, has sung as follows. A savage choir of specters hurtle along the wind, raising their deafening howl to the stars. And here we get the classical tradition. Satyrs and fauns, horned and hoofed with wrathful gaze, fight alongside the ghost. Here too, flocked bird-headed fiends pressing their way, deadly ghouls and witches together, furies bound forward, with them devil gods thronging, jostled by the hell hag and baboon-faced demons. In the early modern period, as the literate class are writing down stories of fairy encounters, you start to hear things that sound a lot like the witch's Sabbath They start to sound a lot like this thing called the wild hunt, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So fairies, by their very nature, particularly as authorities are trying to figure out what the hell is a fairy, all of the adjacent types of supernatural beings and the experiences that come along with those things kind of get stuck. So again, one of these things is called the wild hunt, and you find this all across Europe and certain parts of Asia too. It's this idea of a group of specters hurtling through the night sky on horseback. It's Wotan, it's the Valkyries, but also you get these descriptions of fairies. That's very often called the fairy raid, R-A-D-E. And when we start to get into the period where witches are being persecuted, the witches' Sabbath sounds a lot like this. So here's an image from the 19th century of the wild hunt of Odin. This is something that is completely new to me, and I wanted to share it with you because I think it's so interesting. There is a connection between this phenomena and the clown Harlequin. So there's this old story. There's a king of Britain named King Hurla, and he is invited to a wedding by the king of the dwarves of the king of the fairies. And it's a lot like Rip Van Winkle. He shows up for the wedding. He and his knights have a great time. And when they get back to Earth, 200 years have passed. Not only that, the Saxons have taken over and the Britons are no longer in charge. And he can't get off of his horse without dying. So he's forced for all eternity with his retinue of knights to ride through the night sky. This is the source of the name Earl Konig, or the Earl King, King Hurla. And there's also good evidence that Harlequin, in the Commedia dell'arte can actually be tracked back to this old story of King Hurla, or Herlachining, as he is known in the old Celtic language. Here's another wonderful image of this retinue of fairy specters carrying off a changeling. And of course, this is from the Victorian period. Sir Joseph Noel Paton is one of the best. And you can see that he's included some of these Neolithic stones in the background. So in the 19th century, the folklorists, the archaeologists, and the fairy painters are starting to bring all of this stuff together. And again, as I've just said, the witch's Sabbath, the night ride, is going to become a common theme, obviously in the mythology of the witch hunts. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a second. It's very particular to a number of different texts. But I want to point your attention also, again, in thinking about Christianization, how the fairy and the fairy being is a kind of a pagan Christian hybrid. I mean, in certain ways, fairies are Christian, because the fairy as we know it is a being that has really kind of always, had to contend with Christianity. So here's two interesting images of fairy beings, of mythical beings, coming into contact with Christianity and being transformed by it in some way. It's an old story of Saint Anthony Abbot encountering a centaur in the desert. There's another version of the story where he encounters a satyr, and the centaur is like, I want to become a Christian. And Saint Anthony tells him, I'm sorry, you're not human. And so there is a lot of literature before the modern period of these very sort of sad stories of these pagan beings that want to become Christian, but they can't be because they're not human. And then there's actually some very, very strange literature about, like, well, where do they go? What happens to them? Now, here's an interesting story. This is the story of Saint Murugan, who is a princess who falls into the sea, becomes a mermaid, lives underwater for many centuries, and then is brought back up by a Christian missionary and turned back into a mortal woman. But she is a mermaid for an extended period of time. And of course, if we're talking about Christian saints and fairies, we must talk about Joan of Arc, because, and there's been a lot of work, scholarly work done on this. Where does Joan first encounter the Virgin and the different saints? Saint Michael, there's a variety of different luminous beings that she encounters. It's near a spring. It's near a sacred oak. And this is very similar in the 19th century to the Marian apparitions that, people like Bernadette are encountering at Lourdes. A cavern, a holy tree, a body of water, a well. These places have long associations with intelligent beings, sometimes called fairies, sometimes called other things. And the language of the saints, the cult of the Virgin, very often is superimposed over these things. And so in the story of Joan of Arc, even in her own trial, you get some mention of, well, isn't it true that you and your friends were like always hanging wreaths on that tree? There's something kind of suspicious about that, honoring the tree. So I wanted to point that out. So when we're talking about the modern world, we're talking about the encroachment of science, and we're talking about the encroachment of a new way of trying to grapple with this. So just as Christians have been trying to grapple with the existence of fairies, because they, for the most part, do believe in them, but how do they fit into theology? How do they fit into salvation? Paracelsus, who's one of the great early modern medical reformers, trying to move medicine away from the Galenic system and more into an experimental, observational, also folk tradition type of thing, because Paracelsus is hanging out with herbalists, he's hanging out with people who tend the ancient spas and gaining their knowledge. He says, look, these things called elementals are real, and they occupy the four traditional elements. And I'm going to tell you how they fit into Christian theology. Let's go back to this slide. This is from Manly P. Hall's wonderful The Secret Teachings of All Ages. This is great. So this is a modern illustration, early 20th century, but I just love it. You have the enchanter here, and through his rites of ceremonial magic, he's connecting with these different elementals, who are essentially fairies that occupy these different spaces. So Paracelsus says the gnomes are in the earth, the undines are in the water, the sylphs are in the air, and of course the salamanders are in the fire. And the text, which you can find online, if you can't, email me and I can send you a link to it, is called A Book of Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders and Other Spirits. So again, we're in the early modern period, late Renaissance. This is the time of the scientific revolution. When people talk about the witch hunts, it's not medieval. I can't stress that enough as a historian. It is early modern. And it's important to understand that, because this wholesale, insane, mass persecution of women, men, children, animals who are witches is directly related to the wars of religion, and it's directly related to a massive anxiety that is overtaking a lot of the power centers of Europe, because they want to make sure that the common people are committed and that they have allegiance not just to the church, but to the proper church authority. But it's coming into conflict with certain things that are arising out of the scientific revolution. So let's see how that's related to fairies. I want to point your attention to two texts in the 17th century that are really important. The first one is Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft. Reginald Scott is highly skeptical about the existence of witches. And he basically says fairies are kind of a delusion, right? It's a folktale, it's an old wives' tale. King James of Scotland and then later England does not agree with that. He says, oh, no, people are encountering fairies. But if you encounter a fairy and you're getting help from a fairy, you're probably a witch, because a fairy is a demon. He also suppresses Reginald Scott's text, because he does not agree with it and he feels that it's dangerous. And if you're interested in the history of witch hunting, King James I and his demonology are very, very important in that. In fact, when James is King of Scotland, before he comes down to England and takes over after the death of Elizabeth, he presides over some very dramatic witch trials. I'm going to skip through this, but it's basically just some quotes from the demonology and also from King James, pointing out why they think a fairy is what it is. So again, Reginald Scott is saying, delusion doesn't exist, let's be rational. King James is saying, oh, no, there are spirits, and they're not angels, they're demons. So a little bit later, there's someone named Reverend Robert Kirk, who's really, really important because he's a true believer in fairies. He has a different kind of anxiety. This is later in the 17th century, and atheism is starting to creep into sort of the rationalist Enlightenment project. And Robert Kirk is patronized by Robert Boyle, who's one of the fathers of the scientific revolution. And Boyle is also very interested in the occult. And what they think, because the fairy belief and also the belief in second sight so permeates Scotland, is that if they can make a record of this and prove that it exists, second sight and also the existence of fairies, it will actually turn people away from atheism. And so much like Paracelsus, Robert Kirk's text, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fairies, and Fauns, is an attempt to prove that these middle of the road beings, these intermediate beings, right? These fairies, these elves, these fauns, are creations of God. They are evidence for the benevolence of God. And if we understand how to be in right relationship with them, we don't need to be afraid of them. They exist in this parallel world, and they can't really harm us, if we're respectful and we understand what they are. And truth be told, they can act as a kind of miracle to turn people who are being tempted towards atheism back to God. Now, I think that's fascinating. And in a certain way, that's also what Paracelsus is trying to do. He's saying, no, of course, these beings exist. But let's be sure we understand how they fit into the proper understanding of Christian cosmology. And let's make sure that we understand how they point us toward a right relationship, not just with God, but with our own understanding with what God's plan is. Robert Kirk's notebooks have now been photographed, and the gentleman who's done this, Kevin Manwaring, I just found these this week. I'm so excited about this. He points out that Kirk is really afraid. And he said, if you read this little journal, Kirk confides his sorrow because he really feels that second sight and the human connection to the fairies is disappearing. 3 books I want to point out to you. And if you take the class, we'll get into a lot more of the secondary literature and also primary sources. I think Diane Purkis's book, it's hard to find. Email me and I can point you in the right direction. At the Bottom of the Garden is just wonderful. She goes from the ancient classical world all the way up to the Cottingley fairy case. Scottish Fairy Belief is an excellent book. And then a lot of work is being done by historians to try to really reclaim indigenous European shamanic traditions. Because what we now are coming to understand is that you actually can look at the cunning folk, fairy witch, fairy connection tradition, particularly in these Western European countries, but also in Central Europe too, and Eurasia, as shamanic. Of course it is. This is something that humans have always done, but it's new for Western European historians to feel comfortable in really taking a good hard look at what has been discounted as superstition and saying no. It connects us to something that's very, very old and primordial. I want to talk a little bit about literature. I'm probably going to run out of time, but if we're talking about fairies, we have to think about the Arthurian tradition, because all throughout the high medieval Arthurian romances, there are always these powerful fairy women. And sometimes going back to that old idea of fairy is not a thing so much as it is a place, it is a dimension. There are these women, they don't have wings, they're not tiny, they're enchantresses. They come from other world. And they very often are sometimes like, Morgan Le Fay is the half sister of King Arthur. They're very often tangentially related to a king or to a hero, but they are sometimes also his initiator and his guide, and very often his destroyer, if we're thinking about the story of Nimue and Merlin, right? I love this image. This is the Lady of the Lake leading, leading Sir Lancelot to find something in a dream. So he's in his nightgown. So in the high medieval romance, the fairy can also act as psychopomp. And again, I've talked a little bit about this in my references to Joan of Arc and to Lourdes, uh, to, um, to Bernadette of Lourdes. But Mariolatry, the connection of the Queen of Heaven, the Holy Mother, to the Queen of the Fairies. It's the goddess, of course it is. But it pops up over and over and over and over and over again. So, and I think even sometimes when you look at these images of Mary surrounded by these clouds of angels or cherubs, it's very, very much like what the Romantics are creating in their images of Titania, surrounded by her swarms of fairy attendants. And also in this idea of the goddess or the queen of the fairies as the dom, right? As the dominant figure. I think of Titania and Bottom. Hello, the name. But also he's turned into an ass, right? So I'm thinking also of, we go back to classical tradition of Circe, right? This dominant, fearsome, seductive, powerful female energy who is drawing the sort of male hero to her to be seduced, to be initiated, and possibly destroyed. Something to pay attention to, because it's there. It's there through the whole tradition. I was thinking today about that lovely film from the 1980s, when I was growing up, Willow, in which the Queen of the Fairies and an infant savior who's female are a central part of the story, drawing on that archetypal image, the fairy godmother. Um, Chaucer's story, The Wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales, she talks about, her story is really this initiation story, where a man who has essentially, I think he's raped somebody, is forced to go on a quest to redeem himself. And he is put through a series of trials and tribulations by female powers. And if you haven't read The Wife of Bath's Tale, and you're interested, do read it. It's really fascinating. She talks about something very interesting that is a theme that comes up over and over again in the literature of fairy, and that is that the fairies were much more prevalent in the time of my grandmother. So there's this theme that comes up and up again, is once upon a time, in a long ago time, the fairies were much more prevalent, but they're going away now, or they've gone away, or you can't find them that often. They're not there as much. And that's something that she mentions, or I should say Chaucer mentions, as the wife of Bath. In the Elizabethan period, we've talked a little bit about the scientific revolution, what's going on in sort of the scientific rationalist world, but in the world of literature of the time, we think about the importance of Elizabeth I, that native, it's not really native, I guess we're a few centuries away from the Norman conquest, so it's become native, fairy. The tradition of the fairy queen is now being employed politically. And of course, Edmund Spenser is writing the fairy queen as sort of coming out of that courtly romance tradition, but there's a strong, strong moral element. So the moralism is coming in there too. But it's also a way to glorify the queen. And so Gloriana, the queen of the fairies, is an archetypal creation done to draw attention to the grandeur of Elizabeth I. Shakespeare, of course, is a part of this tradition. Shakespeare is interesting because he's drawing on so many different sources. He's drawing on the native folkloric sources, but he's also drawing on the classical tradition. And because this is the time of the Renaissance, this is the time of the return of so much classical learning to Western Europe, it's finding its way into everything. And the fairies are now being yoked and connected sort of backwards to a lot of these more classical beings, the ones that we were talking about earlier, the nymphs, the satyrs, things like that. Case in point, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck is coming from Puka, Robin Goodfellow, right? This very, very old Celtic entity. Oberon comes from Albrecht, the king of the dwarves, who shows up in Wagner in the Nibelungenlied, right? and who's possibly connected to the Merovingians, the first king of the Merovingians, Merovecus. His brother is a sorcerer, named Albric. And then I didn't know this until recently. Titania is a titaness. So Shakespeare uses that name because in one of the sources he's drawing on, Diana or Artemis is called Titania, or she's the titaness. Some images for you from a Jacobin mask, showing you how the image of the fairy is now being connected to insects, to the elemental sort of powers. I'll show you this very quickly. This is a very, very interesting thing. We're going to be talking at length about colonialism and race in relationship to fairies. It's actually quite a large topic. This is something called the Mask of Blackness, which took place at the court of St. James, where, excuse me, not the court of St. James, at the court of King James, where it's the first record I think that we have of blackface. And it's also it's tied into exoticism. It's tied into the colonial empires of the British, but it's also tied into, in certain ways, into fairy lore. We'll talk more about this in class. But Shakespeare is drawing on not just these classical sources, not just these indigenous and also Norman French sources. He's very interested in what's happening with the stories of the New World, right? The still Bermuthes and, you know, Brazil, all these places. And so there is a racializing and a racialized component in Caliban and also in Ariel. And a lot of work has been done in literary study on that. And it's certainly finding its way into visual culture studies and into the study of fairies. I thought this was fun. I had always heard this, and you probably have too. Queen Mab is Queen Maeve, you know, Maeve, the old Irish figure. Turns out it's possibly from the name Mabel. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I think that's quite fascinating. So an image of Queen Maeve, and then of course we have a wonderful Henri Fuseli painting of Queen Mab casting her spell on a sleeper. Shakespeare, of course, talks about Queen Mab in that speech from Romeo and Juliet. This is something very fascinating. A lot of the noble families of Europe claim descent from supernatural entities. And the Melusine, who's a water demon or a water fairy, 3 of the old Frankish houses claim descent from her. The House of Lusignan, the House of Anjou, and the House of Luxembourg. And if you're a fan of the White Queen, you know that Elizabeth Woodville, who becomes Queen of England, is descended from the House of Luxembourg. And her mother is actually put on trial for witchcraft, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. And so there's some wonderful things about the relationship of these queens to witchcraft, to matriarchy, and to perhaps being descended from a mermaid. And if you want to read more about the history of the Melusine, just Google it. She's a shapeshifter. She turns into a flying dragon while she's in the bath. It's a fabulous story. So if we're talking about the modern world, of course, we have to talk about the fairy tale. We have to talk about where that comes from. The fairy tale, as we know it, as a literary construction, comes out of the 17th century in France. It comes from a wonderful group of female writers who are known as the Precieuses, the Preciouses, the precious ones. One of them is Madame d'Aulnoy, and they are very often aristocratic women who hold salons, and they're taking a lot of these folkloric elements and they're writing these rather long novels. And this is also where the fairy godmother starts to show up in a lot of these fairy stories. Les contes de fées, the fairy tale. That word comes from the French into English through the literary fairy tales of people like Madame d'Aulnoy. And also from Charles Perrault, who of course, the translations of Charles Perrault's fairy tales is coming into England, and it's having a major, major impact on the literary scene. He says something very funny about the fairy godmother in his The Moral to the Tale. Because remember, a lot of these French fairy tales, because they're written for a literate courtly audience, and very often for people who are from the high bourgeoisie or the lower aristocracy. There's a lot of social climbing going on. A lot of these fairy tales are thinly disguised satires. And so at the end of Cinderella, one of the morals to the story is you can be as gracious and as lovely and as kind as Cinderella, but you need a fairy godmother if you're going to be accepted at court. And of course, if we're thinking about the fairy godmother as being such an important component in the history of the way that we moderns think about fairies, I just want to point your attention to the idea of the fates. The fates often show up in a lot of these stories in the form of fairies to sort of speak the destiny of the child. Here's an image by Henry Justice Ford showing one of these ancient Celtic kings, Ogier the Dane, receiving a blessing from fairies. So it's in a lot of these different traditions, and it's in this period of time that the fairy tale writers are kind of bringing it all together. Trina Shardt-Hyman, the American illustrator, was a very dear friend and an important mentor to me. So, and if you don't know her illustrations, I encourage you to go seek her out. She was wonderful, wonderful. But here's an image from her Sleeping Beauty showing the Fae gathered at the christening. Two more images, Caraboss, the Evil Fairy by Leon Bax from the ballet. And of course, Cinderella's Fairy Godmother Coming Out of the Flames by Oliver Herford. If you haven't seen Donkey Skin, the wonderful French film, which is a retelling of the fairy tale Donkey Skin, which comes out of this literary tradition of Madame d'Aulnoy. And it was done as this very campy musical in the 1970s. But it's absolutely wonderful with Catherine Deneuve and Delphine Seyrig. And they really capture the friskiness and the strangeness and the weirdness of a lot of this sort of 17th century French fairy tale tradition and make it relevant. Very, very lovely. Folklorists will tell you that the fairy godmother is really a type of the donor figure. And all across the world, you see this. The hero or the heroine is helped out by a donor. Very often it's an animal. Sometimes it's a ghost, the ancestor figure. So the fairy godmother is a member of that sort of folkloric group of entities, the one who helps you out on the quest. We don't have time to talk about this, but we'll talk about it in class. The miniaturizing of the fairy, you start to see this in the literature of the 18th century. The fairies are thought of in terms as being, being little and insect-like. They're small, they're wispy. Of course, we have to mention the Grimm brothers, whose book Kinder und Hausmärchen, stories for children and from the household, sort of starts the ball rolling in the 19th century. And it gets the middle classes in particular and the literate classes to really start thinking about all of these stories that come to us from our different traditions are precious things. They need to be preserved, right? There's this fear, and it's a fear that's arising in relationship to nationalism in the 19th century. And it's related to industrialization. The way that we have lived close to the earth, our traditions, our manners, our customs, grandma's stories, these things are going to vanish away if we don't save them. Of course, we now know that a lot of what the Grimm brothers were collecting were stories that had already been filtered through a literary milieu. So many of their sources were literate women who were related to a lot of the noble and high bourgeois households that they had relationships with. A wonderful short book I would encourage you to read, and many of you might have, called Clever Maids, came out I think about 15 years ago, is a history of 5 of the women who basically brought these stories to the Grimm brothers. Really fascinating. This type of resurgence and interest in the fairy being is very much related to the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. And if you're thinking about the Germanic world, you have to only to look to Goethe and then also to Wagner, two of the greatest artists of the German 19th century who have had such a huge impact on culture. And central to so much of their work are fairy beings. Of course, Goethe's Faust, fairies and devils and all kinds of entities, play throughout parts 1 and 2. But the Earl King, really, really important. That gets set to music. That's the Harlequin figure we were just talking about. But also in Wagner's Ring Cycle, Alberic and the Rhine Maidens, these very, very old Teutonic entities out of the Nibelungenlied, are being utilized. But both Goethe and then later Wagner, and we know all of the sort of toxic rivers that flows into the 20th century, are very, very interested in what is it that's very German about these things? What is it that comes up out of the earth, the Erdegeist, that has to be captured and retained and also put into a kind of art so that it can be delivered in glorified form to the people? It's related to industrialization as well. I love this. This is Carl Spitzig's his painting, Gnome Watching a Railway Train from 1848. It's a German painter. And then, of course, Richard Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle's uncle, one of the great fairy painters, Woodmen and Elves. Very, very, very strong thing happening in the visual arts in the 19th century. A conscious image making of the fairy being under threat, the fairy being taking notice of what Blake called the satanic mills, right? The Secret of Rowan Inish really, really gets to the heart of this. One of the most glorious films, in my opinion, and certainly I think one of the best fairy movies, based on a book called A Child of the Western Isles. It's a retelling of a Selkie myth, but it takes place in the early 20th century. And one of the main themes is the going away. When we leave the land, when we leave the place of the ancestors, when we are divorced from the ancestral powers, how is it that we reconnect with them? Well, in this case, the ancestral powers come looking for us. A wonderful statue was erected in 2014 of the Selkie, the seal woman, near the Faroe Islands. I wanted to point out something else, because again, we're talking about fairies and modernity here. And that is, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the talk about modernity forces us into our heads. The fairies, the spirits, they live in our heads now. And you can see this in a lot of the romantic art of the time, the poet's dream here, and then another John Anster Fitzgerald, the artist's dream. The creative person, and very often the mentally disturbed person, experience fairies in the imagination. They can experience them in a productive, creative way if they are an artist, but if they suffer from mental illness or are disturbed in some other way or don't have a grasp on reality, the fairies can also torment them. But the fairy realm moves out of the woods and into the head. And also, I would say, into artistic production. This is something that you see throughout all of modernity, right? That which was fantastical is medicalized or aestheticized. It's fine in a work of art, it's fine in a film, or it's fine if you're alone, but you might want to see a doctor about that, because that voice is not coming from the tree. Case in point, Richard Dadd, one of the greatest fairy painters of the Victorian period, was institutionalized for a number of years. And that's, I think he attacked his father. It's a very sad story. But in the Victorian world, there is this, it's very complicated, but there is a connectivity between mental illness and between fairies for various reasons. And in his case, he actually was confined for some very, very erratic behavior and violent behavior. But he's one of the great painters of the fairies in the Victorian period. Fairy Feller's masterstroke. I'm sure many of you, if you're a fairy fan, you know this. which is just unbelievably complex. It's at the Tate. He was also inspired by Shakespeare. Of course, Blake was. All of these romantic fairy people were coming to these yellow sands and take hands. Wonderful quote from The Tempest. Another one of Richard Dadd's Puck. We're running out of time here, but I'll end this shortly. John Anster Fitzgerald, another one of these great Victorian painters you must know about. But the way that we see fairies really comes from the way that the Victorians imagined them. And in the class, I'll talk a lot more about how that's also related to science and to even to Darwin. Richard Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle's uncle, wonderful illustrator, and spent a lot of time making images of fairies. Also had some, I believe was institutionalized for a while. I don't remember why. But if you read the histories of Victorian fairies, the relationship to mental illness and the relationship of hysteria, all these different sort of medicalized ways of dealing with intense psychological experiences, it's very much entangled with the fairies. I think we're going to end it here, Joanna, because we're actually running out of time. You'll just have to take the class if you want more. But one of the things I want to end on is that science, technology, and these new relationships to what the modern world has sort of done to us in the way that we just go about our daily lives has sort of compressed the fairies and the fairy beings into this other place. And I think that's something that we're certainly going to talk a lot more about it in class, but all of the different ways that that occurs are very, very important, I think, to understand. And that's something that we'll definitely tackle in the course. So shall we open it up for some questions?
Yeah, that sounds great, Jason. Thank you so much. Incredible artwork, incredible research and incredible artwork. Really, really beautiful stuff. We already have one question in the Q&A, and before I read it, I just want to invite other people in the audience, if you have any questions, to type it either into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll happily share it with Jason. So an anonymous attendee asks, would you be able to speak to theories that connect changelings to things like autism or other developmental differences?
Yes, this is a big, I don't want to say field of study, area of study right now, but particularly since this sort of neurological revolution in the last 15 years in the sciences and the humanities. I can't speak to it because I haven't done a lot of research on it, but it's the work is being done. It's related also to infanticide and to the tradition of how you deal with a baby that is really not well, or that you can't deal with. So as it relates to autism, I don't know for sure, but there are a couple of different female scholars who've actually been working on this. Diane Purkis addresses it a little bit in her book, but she says it's, in the old days, when infanticide was very, very much a part of kind of daily life in most cultures, babies often died anyway. But it was, oh, the fairies took the baby, or I had to take the baby to the woods because it's a changeling, and I was hoping the fairies would come bring the real baby back. There are actually instances of this, but it's a big topic, and a lot of scholars are working on it.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. So we have a question from Tony Wolf, who asks, are you familiar with Bernard Slay's 1926 book, The Gates of Horn, being sundry records from the proceedings of the Society for the Investigation of Fairy, Fact, and Fallacy?
I do know about The Gates of Horn, but I have not read it. So it's something I need to incorporate into the class, it sounds like. And I'm assuming you'd recommend it?
Tony, would you recommend it? And when we await our response to that, we've got another question in the Q&A. Shem Powell says, these slides dealt primarily with the European tradition.
Yep.
What of the little peoples and giants of the Inuit and First Nations people?
That's going to be the second week of our class, where we look at where we leave Europe. and we're like, okay, this is a human thing, and we'll be traveling all over the world, but we're definitely going to be looking at Inuit traditions, Native American traditions, a lot of island traditions. We'll be looking at the Philippines, North Africa. So yes, today was focusing mostly on fairy as fairy, but in the class, we're definitely going to be diving into this topic from a global point of view.
Great. I'll put a link one more time for the class so people have access to it and don't have
Joanna,
to scroll back.
that might actually be a good talk for the future, to take that to do a talk on non-Western fairies. I think that would be good.
I think that would be a fabulous idea, anytime you wish. And so Tony did respond to your question. He says he republished it last year and he'll send you a copy if you like. So I can put you guys in touch off screen time.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, we have a question from Marika Gretsch, who says, I thought that Victorian artists were on drugs when doing their pieces, but you have totally enlightened me. It can't be a coincidence that fairy lore is a common denominator. You have opened my eyes.
Well, I just want to say, these folks, alcohol, laudanum.
So not so simple.
Cocaine, yeah.
Okay. So I put the link to the class in the chat one more time. And we also have a comment from Eleanor Crook, who says, what a gorgeous presentation. Thanks. And for connecting what's always been a missing link to me between the classical myths and these non-classical entities. Tony, there's a comment where someone would like to order a copy of your book, if you want to put a link in the chat there. Shan Powell says, I'd love to get a copy of the books you mentioned, but all of them seem to be out of print and very expensive. Any ideas where to get them affordably?
We'll talk offline.
Okay. So Shan, if you send an email to Morbid Anatomy, I can send it on to Jason. So Eleanor Crook says, so many of us receive these stories in childhood when our psyches are malleable. What place do they occupy in adult capitalist alienated consciousness after we grew up? How do you see them breaking through?
Well, I think this, and we'll look at this, particularly in the 19th century, this idea of fairies and spirits being medicalized or being aestheticized. You can talk about them and put them into a novel, into a poem, into a movie, but they come through the screen now. And I mean, you go sit in I think, if you get close to nature, you can get back to these things. I didn't have time to talk about that, but in the class, we're going to talk about ecology and the sort of new way that people are like, we have to get back to this type of connection to these, we call them beings, experiences. But I'm sorry, Eleanor, I just want to say one other thing. I think that's the problem. And I think that's because they are merely just aesthetic objects now.
We have a question from Kim about the class. She said, in the class, are you going to be discussing utopias and fairies, Jesuits / Guarani in Paraguay?
I don't know about that. I am going to, no, so let's connect and talk more about that, because I'm learning. I hadn't thought about the utopian connection, but we are going to be going into the whole connection of when I say early modern, the early modern European colonial sort of scientizing of the world, and the way that fairy lore and Christianity and colonialism kind of converge into all these really weird ways.
Okay, we've got a few more questions in the Q&A. So Nick Hagenboom says, any thoughts on fairy lore and their connections to modern UFO and abduction folklore? Cultural significance?
Are we still sharing the screen here?
Yeah.
Da, 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 da. I didn't get to the slide. And we're going to talk about queerness and fairies too, everybody, which I'm really excited about. I love this t-shirt, male, female, fae. So here, I am trying to, hold on, I can't see. Yes, the Mothman. We are going to be definitely talking about the UFO phenomenon and fairies. Little gray men, the Mothman, the whole thing about when alien abductions occur or alien encounters occur, time, the missing time thing, that's a whole phenomenon that occurs in all the lore of fairy, like King Hurla. You go away and you lose time. You are taken into this other dimension where space and time get, yeah, we're gonna definitely talk about it, because there's a very powerful connection.
And we have a question from Michelle Falkenstein, who says, I recall seeing a film about a highway building project in Ireland that was modified to go around a certain knoll because fairies were said to live there. Is this a unique case in our contemporary times?
Hi, Michelle. I'm so glad you're here. Yes, and I have a wonderful link. Joanna, I will send you a bunch of things that you can put up when you post the video. But one of them is a wonderful, well, two wonderful videos. One is from 1960 of the felling of a fairy thorn tree in Northern Ireland and all the commotion that causes. And the second thing I'm going to send you are some things about contemporary Icelandic road building and the Alfar, older, the hidden people. The specific thing that you're referencing, I don't know about, but it's, yeah, it's a thing.
Okay, great. And Eleanor just asked for more information about the class. So I just posted the title and the time in case other people are wondering about that, and the link one more time. And it looks like we don't have any more questions. We do have a comment from Tara, who says that in the neo-pagan community, fairies are still very much alive. Yes. And Tessa, who says, this is absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I regret not having the means to take your course right now, but hopefully he'll be offering it again. So stay tuned for that. And C says, thank you. What a fascinating hour. Lots of positive feedback. And I also put a link to Tony's book in the chat for the person who wanted a link to that book that he had republished last year. So thanks everyone so much for spending part of your Sunday with us. You're welcome for the link, Kim, my pleasure. And hope to see you in Jason's class or at a future talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Jason, thank you for your beautiful work. Your level of research and curiosity and professionalism is so wonderful, always inspiring to see. And your collection of images is really fabulous.
Well, thank you again for creating this community or creating the space for this community to form. I can't thank you enough for that. It's been a great deal to me, and I know it has been a great deal to many, many other people. Well,
it is our honor to have you as a part of it, and all of you who are here today too. We hope to see you at a future talk, future class, perhaps in person in New York. Anyway, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day and see you later. Bye, everyone.
Take care.